Welcome on in, football fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS and prop preview for tonight's showdown slate between the Eagles and the Packers. We've got ourselves some Friday night football heading into the weekend the right way with back-to-back nights of a showdown slate. And here in this video, I'm going to give you a quick breakdown of what to expect from tonight's matchup, both from the showdown and fantasy perspective, and of course out there from props on Underdog and Prize Picks. So for showdown, I'm going to focus on some of the ownership trends heading into this slate. Also talk about some game script stuff to go out there and get your research started. And then on the prop side of things, I've got 4 props that I've already entered that are going to be some solid value to go out there and attack. So if you're here for props, just skip to the middle to latter half of the video. If you're here for everything and anything in between, well, welcome, glad to have you, and let's go ahead and hop right on in. The over-under for this game is one of the higher ones of the entire week. So up there at 49 points, 48.5 out there in some books, and you're going to see a relatively close game as well, at least if the spread is going to be correct. So as of right now, you've got the Eagles as slight favorites, but based on my own intuition, I've got the under as a good lean for tonight. Also, perhaps even the +2 side there on the Packers. I think there's a good chance they win outright here early in the year, a team on the ascent that I think is going to be a lot better than a lot of the other people in the industry. And on top of that, you've got an Eagles team that was on the descent out there at the end of 2023. So obviously, the sports books, the community sentiment is on the other side, but just starting things off, wanted to go ahead and hammer that off at the beginning. But in terms of our ownership trends, you've got, I would say, a lot of ownership in general down here in the 6 and 5K range, and not as much towards the bottom end of the board. Your top end players are always going to be the highest owned guys out there on Showdown, but towards the bottom end of the board, there are a few things that I want to point out. So what you'll see down here is that the defenses are not going to be all that popular. Your kickers are also about medium to maybe even below average ownership from what we usually see for kickers. And then your pure punts, so and by pure punt, I mean guys like, $3,000 or cheaper, there's no one down here except for these defenses is going to be over the 10% ownership mark. So I would say that in general, you're going to be looking at a lot more of a balanced lineup construction out there for the field. So just starting out right off the bat, if you're going to try and get different from how you're building your lineups, if you went studs and duds, if you found one of those pure punt plays towards the bottom end of the board, is going to get you extremely different this time around. There are times where we have guys down there that are 20, sometimes even 30% owned that the entire field is getting to, and out here, at least for Friday night football, that is not going to be the case. A few other pieces of ownership I want to point out before we go player by player. You've got Jalen Hurts up there at 81%, so in terms of your spend ups, it's him. You've got Jordan Love at about 61%, and then it's relatively spread out. You've got about 46% out there on an A.J. Brown, who I guess the one reason to not play him would be the price tag. He is relatively expensive out there for this kind of slate. Saquon's also at about that same sort of ownership. Devonta Smith a little bit lower owned than those top 2 options. And then you've got Josh Jacobs around 50%. So for the guys that are at least $8,000, it's all, like I said, pretty condensed out there from the ownership angle. When you get a little bit below that is where Dobbs, because of his price tag, just like A.J. Brown, maybe a little bit overpriced on this kind of slate. You can see I've got him at slightly lower ownership, and then it's pretty spread out for guys like a Jaden Reed, a Dallas Goedert, and a Christian Watson. So I think if you're going to try and get cute with the ownership, there's not a ton of spots to go out there and do so. Maybe you have A.J. Brown captain lineups that are a little bit lower owned than some of these other top end options. Maybe you can force yourself up to a Romeo Dobbs even at that lower points per dollar projection. But I think the easier way to get different would be to go with 5-1 lineups out there for either team. And what I mean by 5-1 would be to take 5 players from one of the 2 teams and then just one buyback out there, which of course, that's the optimal lineup and onslaught sort of thing. And of course tonight, right, really close spread, right, 49 point total. I think a lot of people out there are going to be tempted to play 3 threes and just try and take a bunch of offensive targets, wide receivers from both teams out there. That's going to be the incredibly chalky build. And in my opinion, that's why these guys like a Jaden Reed, a Dallas Goedert, a Christian Watson are so chalky for tonight, is because everyone wants to jam in that kind of build. They want to have these skill position players as their mid to lower owned options. And a quick way to get different, and really what I'm going to do out there in GPPs is I'm going to have exposure to both teams. It's not like I think that the Packers are the only way to go about it tonight. I think that the chalk Eagles make quite a bit of sense as well. It's the deploying them in the right fashion. If you're going to enter the large field GPPs, a good way to get different in a way that I'm approaching it for tonight is going to be to assume that this isn't a close game. Maybe the Packers do go out there and kick some ass, win by 3 touchdowns. Maybe it's the exact opposite. Maybe the Eagles go out there and rekindle their form from the beginning of the 2023 season, where they were maybe the best team out there in the NFL. They go out there, they win by 3 touchdowns. You might have to have a 5-1 onslaught or even just a 4-2 in either direction, is I think going to be a little bit more different than the 3-3s that you're going to see a lot of people going with. So just right off the bat, wanted to handle ownership, how you can get a little bit different. In my opinion, it's a slate where you want to get away from that chalky build, right? Get away from that consensus that the entire player pool is really built around, which is that close game script, right? I mean, a lot of people are going to be playing that. If you're going to choose to follow that kind of chalky sentiment, just know that you're going to have to really force in differentiation. That's where you're going to have to force in a Romeo Dobbs. It's where you're going to have to force in maybe $1,000, $1,500 on the table. It's doable, but there are pros and cons out there to taking that kind of approach. In terms of our players, I want to start towards the top. I'd say that A.J. Brown brings a ton of upside out there in large field GPPs, so I probably don't have to sell you on him too much, but the kind of guy that could go out there for 100 yards, 2 touchdowns, and if he does that, it won't even matter that he's 16 grand at captain. You'll likely have to have him in that sort of situation. Both of these quarterbacks make sense, but I would say that both of them are about adequately owned, so I don't think they're the sort of spot where you got to go out there and try and get a bunch of leverage to the field. I think you should be including both quarterbacks in your exposure. The bigger question is what you're going to do with Hurts at captain, because you can see he's about 25% owned there at the captain spot. And I think a good way to get different tonight, I mentioned that out there for the Chiefs versus Ravens slate, would be to not take a quarterback at captain. Now, the issue with Hurts is that he has so much rushing touchdown upside that it makes it a little bit more difficult to go out there and do so. But you saw that work out there for the first game. You had guys like Isaiah Likely, Rashad Rice, I should say, also Xavier Worthy go out there and have pretty much captain performances are, close to it out there with the other two that weren't the optimal captain, and the quarterbacks weren't even close. I mean, I guess the closest was Lamar out there to the optimal lineup last night, but it was a lot of those skill position players. So I always want to point this out. I'll be doing it for every showdown slate that we do this year, is that the quarterbacks are normally a lot higher owned out there at captain than they probably should be. So I still think they're great pieces. You should be building around them out there in your lineups tonight, but I think that the more interesting part to look at would be whether you use them out there at captain or not. Personally, probably not using either one at captain. You can see over here to the right, of course, my exposure has not been filled out. So as the evening goes on, as the afternoon gets towards the evening, I will be updating this over there on the Patreon page. So if you're wondering who I'm playing for tonight, you want all of these projections for yourself as they go ahead and mature throughout the day. Of course, closer to lock, right, these ownership numbers will probably change quite a bit as we can get a better sense of some of that industry sentiment. Maybe even the projections change based on some of the inactives and actives that we get later on. If you want all of that, the most up-to-date information possible, my entire player pool, all the scripts that I'm taking, all of that, make sure to check out the Patreon. There's a link in the description of the video to that. It is just $15 a month to join the DFS tier, which is the best industry, the best deal in the industry, I should say. It's only $15 for an entire month of main slate and showdown stuff. So we had to cover it for Thursday, Friday. We'll have Sunday night football, also Monday night football for every single week, as well as that main slate out there on Sunday. So check it out if you guys haven't already, and that's where you guys can see the entire player pool. I'm moving down a little bit further, so we've gone past the quarterbacks here. I think Saquon's a really good spot, especially if you're playing like an Eagles onslaught. And I guess just to go through this a little bit, these running backs, I'd say Saquon and Josh Jacobs, if you're going to take the same approach as me, right, try and play against the chalk for tonight, I think you're going to be playing a lot of Saquon and a lot of Josh Jacobs, because in an onslaught kind of build, these players are going to see a huge increase out there in their usage. And I think that both teams are live to go out there and have an onslaught sort of day, so I would be including them in those sort of lineups. Devonta Smith, he's $9 grand. I wouldn't even say it's too cheap out there for him, but it's also probably not too expensive. Probably adequately priced out there at $9 grand. You could use him at captain. He's a little bit lower owned than some of the other players in this range, but not crazy low ownership. As I said before, right? It's all pretty spread out up there towards the top end of the board. Romeo Dobbs a little bit expensive, but if you're going to use him in GPPs, you'll get a little bit different, a little bit of leverage out there with that sort of player. Jaden Reed might be my favorite player on the slate, so even though he's not down there as a yes quite yet, I will 100,000% be using him at flex. It's just a question of whether I'm going to take a shot at captain in a few lineups. Dallas Goedert, same thing. Probably one of my favorite plays on the slate. So I mentioned before that this mid-tier range was going to be higher owned just because of people wanting to land on these players, and I tend to agree with it. I do like Dontavian Wicks out there for tonight. I think Christian Watson is more of a GPP play. Unfortunately, the ownership's there out there with Christian Watson, but he's got a very wide range of outcomes. He's likely either going to go out there completely flop tonight or go out there and have a pretty solid performance, over 10 fantasy points. So he's the kind of guy that's boom or bust. You want to have him in the right format, and in GPPs, he's the exact kind of guy that I'm personally looking for. So this range in general, I think makes a lot of sense. Personally, I'm just going to make sure I'm using them the right way, right? I'm going to have exposure to all of these sort of players, but it's going to be in onslaught builds where I'm not going to be nearly as chalky as the rest of the field is. These kickers, these defenses, if you're going with, again, I think the under might be the play out there for the slate. Reason for that, by the way, it's in Brazil. They're traveling. There's some jet lag maybe going on. On top of that, you've also got to deal with the fact that it's early in the year. These offenses are probably going to be a little bit scrappy. You didn't really see that with the Chiefs and Ravens. They're some of the best teams out there in the league, but especially when we get to the main slate out there on Sunday, I think you're going to see a lot of sloppy play. So I think the defenses are still in play in this kind of scenario, and especially if you're going to be playing 5-1 onslaughts. The defenses are certainly going to come into play in those kind of lineups, and even out there in some 4-2s. You could go out there and mix in either side of that. Moving down to the bottom end of the board, I think Kenneth Gainwell is live to get some snaps tonight, so you could play him at 3,400. He's not projecting through the roof or anything, but is the kind of guy that in large field GPPs could get there, kind of like you saw a Justice Hill last night. You had a Jahan Dotson down here at $3,200. I believe he's the third or maybe even fourth string wide receiver out there for the Eagles. I think officially third, but it's going to be mixing in some snaps out there with fellow rookie. I shouldn't say fellow rookie. He's not a rookie, but rookie Johnny Wilson will also get some snaps out there for the Eagles. You could take these sort of guys. You can include Johnny Wilson in that too, down there at $1,600. They're at least going to play for the Eagles. They might get a big play out there in their small level of usage, but who knows? Worth noting that Lloyd, Kraft, and Wilson, all out there for the Packers, are technically questionable at this point, but I am expecting them to play as of this morning. So we'll have to see if that changes, but at least worth pointing out there from the injury perspective. We've got Will Shipley. He's going to be the third string running back for the Eagles, but the one thing worth noting is that the third string running back for Philly usually gets snaps, unlike what you see out there for other teams. In the past, sometimes that had been Gainwell that was getting snaps out there as the third stringer. Bo Melton, Grant Calcaterra, you could play him as, a pure punt play out there in GPPs, but these sort of guys are probably out of play for me. So if I'm going to go with a value option, it's the Johnny Wilson's, just hoping that he goes out there and maybe gets a red zone target out there with his big target, big frame, I should say. Jahan Dotson, hope that he gets a big play out there with some of his usage, but I kind of understand why people are going to this 5 and 6K range out there for a lot of their values. So I kind of agree with that sentiment. I just think you need to build the right way. If you're going to enter the large field GPPs, try and get a little bit different to the field by going out there and changing it up with your lineup construction, right? You don't always have to take like pure slapdicks down towards the bottom end of the board or overpay for somebody like a Dobbs or an AJ Brown to get that leverage. Sometimes it can be a little bit simpler as just going out there and playing a different game script than the rest of the field. And now for the prop side of things, and just like I had out there for DFS, on my Patreon page, I do also post all the prop exposure and I'm getting to for any given week. And at this point, they've gone CLV and bumps on over 65% of the props that we've taken. So definitely been a good start to the year, but it's coming to finding value. And if you guys want to see all the prop slips and all the exposure I'm getting to, make sure to check out the Patreon. Again, link in the description of the video. Just like the DFS tier, it's just $15 a month for all of my exposure that I'm getting to, which compared to other touts out there is, first off, great value, and you're going to see a much higher ROI out there with my props. I pretty much only go for plus EV props, only go out there for stuff that I know is going to bump. I mean, you're getting CLV in over 50% of your props. That's how you know you're going out there and you're playing value and you're taking the right sort of spots out there for a game. So, you don't have to question it. You don't have to think of like, oh, are we getting the right sort of props? When you're going out there, you're taking stuff and it's bumping like an hour later, you're on the right track out there. So let's go through some of the exposure character that I'm playing out here for tonight. So first off, we got this Jordan Love over on passing yards. He was at 256.5 on Pinnacle before he went live over here. He was also about minus 129 towards the over. So about minus 130 odds. We go ahead and chalk it up, which when you have that 1 yard discrepancy, it's not that big a deal really at the end of the day. Even that minus 130 juice, it's just a slight lean out there towards the over. What I more so like about Jordan Love is how inefficient the Eagles were against the pass last year. So you could say, right, there's a little bit of plus EV lean out there in terms of the sportsbook lines. What I more so like here is the fact that he's playing that very soft defense. And while they might be a little bit more stout here in 2024, you're going to doubt that they go from about last place in efficiency out there to the top 10 or anything, right? They might go from last to maybe 20th or 15th out there in terms of efficiency. But with Jordan Love, going out there, lighting it up towards the end of last season, he's got all of his targets here to start 2024. He's got Musgrave at tight end back. He's got all those wide receivers. Josh Jacobs, maybe a slight downgrade compared to Aaron Jones, I should say, out there at running back. But all things, really all systems up out there for Jordan Love. So you give me any sort of sportsbook line value, you give me that kind of matchup out there in Jordan Love. And that's why I was a buyer out there at 255.5 yards. So it's the over there. I do think that in general, if you're looking at the sportsbook line, right, the Eagles are favored. I do think that the Packers have a much better chance to win than maybe some other people out there do. But if you're following that script, if the Eagles are in fact going to be controlling most of this game, then Jordan Love's going to have to be passing the ball a little bit more. So maybe that helps him out there from that perspective. Then on the other side here, this one is not a plus EV play, at least if you're just looking at the sportsbook line. But I do think it is plus EV when you consider the vulture component of this prop. So let's start off with the sportsbook line value. He's about even money on most books to score for tonight. In fact, I think he was even plus 100 over there on FanDuel or something like that. So that would actually mean that his no prop on most sports books would probably be in the minus 130 range out there for no. And in fact, if you look on Pinnacle, he is minus 130 out there towards the no, which is sub-ideal, right? He would say maybe you'd lean on the under if anything out there with this prop. But what you have to consider on Underdog is that they came out with this new program, and I haven't calculated the exact EV of these vulture bets quite yet, but when you have a situation like you have on the Eagles, where your vulture is probably Jalen Hurts, who has about a 50% touchdown equity himself. By the way, on books, he's minus money to score on a lot of them, if not about plus 100 on the worst books out there for Jalen Hurts. Maybe a little bit, I think plus 110 out there in a few books, actually, out there in Jalen Hurts. But if you think that he has a 35 to 40% touchdown equity, that's essentially a 35 to 40% chance that we're going to get a push out there on this sort of prop, let alone when you add in the equity for Saquon Barkley to go out there and hit himself. And when you do that, you can quickly see how this would go from a coin flip, or maybe even a little bit worse than a coin flip, to a heavily plus EV prop. Now, not every situation is the same. So, for example, if you look at the Josh Jacobs side, his vulture equity is much, much lower than what you have with Saquon Barkley. And by the way, it's not just Jalen Hurts, right? That could go out there and vulture a touchdown from Saquon. They could put in Kenneth Gainwell. They could put in Will Shipley out there to vulture a 1 yard touchdown. Whoever it is, right? You go out there and you get that credit out there for Saquon. Whereas over here on the Packers, their backup running backs aren't going to be as big of a factor. Jordan Love doesn't have anywhere close to as much of touchdown equity as what you have out there with Jalen Hurts. So that's why I like this over on Barkley. He's got close to a 50-50 chance anyways to go out there and score. But when you add in all these chances to get this DNP'd, and which would refund, right, this 2-level slip, that's why I went out there and took it for an over. So I am very versed in how the refunds work over here on Underdog, just because in golf, we see a ton of pushes. That's just the nature of betting on golf in general. And that's why I think this might be a plus EV spot. Again, I haven't ran the math yet. It's a very complicated set of, math to go out there and approximate the EV of that sort of situation. But when I looked at it, especially my initial reaction is that it's probably going to be well into our favor. So I'm running it here. We're going to check some of the numbers. We're going to look back on this week after we have the full sample size and see how that went out there for some of the better vulture situations. So that would be the first slip over there in Underdog. And then over here on Prize Picks, they're taking stuff off like crazy. So I had an over on Jaden Reed receptions. So he's at 3.5. They might repost that one. Honestly, I didn't even think it was plus EV compared to books. So I'm not quite sure why they took that one off. And then I also had this Jalen Hurts over on rushing yards. That was actually at 36.5, not this 38.5 number. And then I also had him over 8 rushes. And that got bumped. That actually got taken off the board. I believe he's at 8.5 now. Let's double check on that actually. So yeah, they have him up there at 8.5. So I guess that wouldn't be the worst play, as he was like minus 135, minus 140 towards the over 8.5 on quite a few books out there in the industry. But unfortunately, they did nuke a lot of these off the board. So as I said before, if you want all of my exposure, check out the Patreon page. I'm posting everything over there. But a few things that I was at least considering. I have not gone to these yet, but just I guess to brainstorm, give you guys some ideas over here in Prize Picks. I don't hate the over in AJ Brown. I think he has a big game tonight. He covered this line in over 10 of his 17 games last year. So was very consistent with this sort of line. It does match up against a defense that doesn't have anywhere near enough size in that secondary to go up there and match up against an AJ Brown. And then you guys could see I was taking this like over on Jalen Hurts. A 2-yard bump isn't the worst. In fact, I believe on Pinnacle he was minus 129 towards the over at this number. I believe on a few other books like minus 125, minus 130 odds towards the over. That wouldn't be the worst, but we can't enter 2 Eagles players together. So if you were going to enter something for the Packers, it's a 1-yard difference. Jordan Love on that side. I guess you could go in that direction. I usually try not to double up on players. They did, Jaden Reed is at 41.5, I believe, over there at Underdog. So maybe I wouldn't play that. So yeah, unfortunate that they've gone with all these bumps over here. But yeah, if they repost that Jaden Reed prop, I don't think that's the worst lean at all. And if I was going to take any of these 2.5s, maybe a Musgrave, maybe a Dontavian Wicks. If you can find a little bit of sportsbook line value on either of those players, you could use that as a little bit of a buyback as well. So that's what I would say about the props. Unfortunately, because they bump these things so quickly out here, and at least in today's prop world, it didn't used to be like this bad out there, especially like 2 years ago, 2 NFL seasons. You'd find value like this and it'd be up for a solid like half an hour to a couple hours out there at a time. Now with the automation, you have all these optimizers out there that are helping you find props. With just plus EV in general so much bigger here in this season, especially last year, you really started to see it come out. These are starting to move so much quicker. So it's unfortunate, right? Especially because that's what I use for a lot of my process. But we're going to have to adapt. We're going to have to figure it out at some point. So content-wise, not ideal, but the Patreon place is the ideal place to be, as you can try and catch all of that before it moves. Speaking of, just trying to think through like who the best 2.5 here would be. I do think it might be Wicks. I think that Musgrave would be a solid option as well. If you look at how they did on the line, that was Wicks without all of the options in play. So that's not the best hit rate over there. And by the way, last 5s are not how you should be going out there and evaluating props. I'd probably go Musgrave. It's not because he hit in 3 of his last 5, but more so because he's a tight end, or he's going to see a more reliable snap share than some of these other players. You've got Jaden Reed in the mix. You've got Christian Watson, Dontavian Wicks that are all going to be taking away carries. Musgrave doesn't really have that competition at tight end. So I believe he was also like minus 125, minus 130 towards the over. Odds may have shifted since that point, but if I was going to force in anything with the board that we have available, it probably would be Luke Musgrave. Fellow Luke, that's always a little bonus out there. But yeah, this AJ Brown prop I think makes plenty of sense. And if they do repost that Jaden Reed over at 3.5 receptions, might want to take a look at that one yourself. Alrighty guys, that is all I've got for the Friday Night Football preview. Hopefully you guys are having a fantastic week and ready to get after it for week 1 of the NFL. And tomorrow, maybe even tonight, we'll have to see with the timing of it, we're going to have our week 1 main slate video dropping. On there, of course, we're going to be touching on all of the stacks, all the game environments, and I'm looking at for Sunday's main slate, as well as some props over there on Underdog and Prize Picks, and I'm taking for the large slate of action. We'll have a lot more to work with there, a lot more games to go out there and find some value. So if you're over there on the prop side, definitely make sure to tune in for that. We'll have a lot of value out there for you guys. And then on the stack side of things, a lot of strategy and a lot of my process out there for main slate that we're going to talk about there on that video. So maybe if you're new to main slate DFS, you need a little bit of a strategy refresher, make sure to check into that thing. And yeah, like I said, maybe tonight, probably tomorrow morning out there with that video, but making sure you guys are ready for all of your exposure. I appreciate the support here on the channel as per usual. Go ahead, smash that like button if you if you guys haven't already. Also, subscribe so you don't miss any of that content when it drops. And also, go ahead and comment down below what you've got as the score for tonight. It is an exact score, so this is going to be a tough one to go out there and win. But if you can give me the exact score for tonight's game, you will win 3 months of my Patreon page. So I know it's a lot harder to go out there and get the exact score and whatnot, the exacta, but if you can give me the exacta, we'll win 3 months of my Patreon page, and that'll be a full membership out there for golf and for NFL. That is a $120 value, including all the content that I have. So if you guys can go out there, give me that winner, you will earn those free 3 months out there at the Patreon page. If you want to get it in there yourself, right, you don't want to wait for that kind of giveaway, just go out there, join it, check out the link in the description of the video, and get it that way. But I appreciate you guys. As I said before, best of luck out there with all of your exposure for tonight, and let's go out there and have ourselves an evening.